Thank you very much, Empress Haile Selassie, for that generous introduction. She forgot to mention that I'm the old man of the clan from the great continent, the great village of Africa.
He did.
I want to argue today that international development assistance is a very poor instrument of development policy. And I want to talk about government-to-government assistance and ignore people-to-people assistance. So if you want to sponsor a child in Africa who is going to school or somebody is sick, you want to evacuate them to England, you are welcome to do it. That kind of assistance is less devastating or is less negative than government-to-government assistance. We need to understand aid essentially, international development assistance, essentially as a political instrument. Countries give aid because they have particular interests. They could be security interests, they could be economic interests, they could be geostrategic interests. Now, of course, aid in and of itself is not a bad thing. Money in and of itself is not a bad thing. It is how that assistance interacts with other social realities in a recipient country and in a given country that determines the development outcomes of aid. Let me begin by dissuading you from the Marshall Plan, because it is always given as one of those successful international assistance projects of the world. Please remember that the Marshall Plan money was not given for the development of Europe. Europe was already a developed country. It had already transited from being an agrarian economy into a modern industrial economy with capitalist institutions and bureaucracies already in place. Whether it was Germany, France, or the United Kingdom, they were already developed countries. The Marshall Plan funds were given for the reconstruction of Europe after the devastation brought about by the Second World War. Europe in 1950 was totally different from Africa today. For most countries in Africa, most of the human beings still live in rural areas as peasant farmers. There is a small middle class of urbanized people. The economies are still largely agricultural. Capitalist norms, values, habits, and capitalist institutions have not yet consolidated in these societies. So the process we are looking at is very different. So when aid comes, and whoever gives it, especially the Western world, I want to exclude South Korea, China, and Japan, who give aid. The Western world wants to give aid with conditions. These conditions are that you must be liberal democratic. You must have institutions for electing leaders, for holding leaders to account, checks and balances, parliaments. Please remember that the institutions of the Western world evolved over a long period of time through organically out of the struggles, political and social, that in these countries, they are born of a very particular experience. It is not true that you can transplant Western institutions and superimpose them on our societies and they work exactly as they do. They cannot, because these institutions in Europe are staffed by Europeans. These Europeans have a particular, you Europeans, I look at in front of me, you have a particular understanding of authority, of the configurations of authority. So when you transplant these institutions, you transplant the external form of these institutions, but not the internal logic, because the people who are going to staff these institutions in poor countries have their own way they have been brought up to think and relate to authority. So that is the first problem of international development assistance. It tries to impose long-term trends to a premature conclusion, have democracy, have freedom. These are things that cannot be exported and imposed. They can only evolve out of a people's struggle. People's struggles. The second issue about international development assistance that makes it debilitating is that when it is given to poor countries must domesticate this aid. It feeds into an existing pattern of authority. For example, how is power organized? How is power exercised? And how is it reproduced in a poor country? How is it distributed? Oftentimes, it is through patron-client ties. How can I explain it? A political party or a president uses powerful elites in particular ethnic communities or religious communities to act as a bridge between the state or the ruling party and that community. And exchange relationship is always material incentives, which is corruption. So when you bring aid, it tends to reinforce those patterns of authority, those client-patron relationships that may actually be anti-developmental. Also, because aid is concentrated in the government, it increases the economic attractiveness of politics, and therefore makes everybody want to gain power in order to get access to the foreign aid pie. And one of the reasons why we have ethnic tensions and conflicts in these poor countries is because the state is rich with aid resources that different powerful elites want to capture. I would prefer that these resources be placed in the private sector if they were to be given, so that people compete to be efficient in the market rather than to be powerful in politics. And in fact, if you want to instigate systems, checks and balances on the state, you need to strengthen other actors, especially the private sector, not civil society. I have my own criticism of aid-funded civil society, which I may raise later. If you are an aid giver, I am very conscious of the fact that most of you come from international aid organizations. I understand your dilemma, because if I am an aid giver, there are cases where aid can be a successful instrument of development policy. I have experienced this in a country called Uganda. I have witnessed it in Rwanda. I do not think it would have been possible for Rwanda to recover from genocide at the speed it has done without international assistance. But the conditions that make aid effective are very rare to find and difficult to recreate. One of the reasons why Rwanda has been successful is that the genocide destroyed all the centers of power and left the society open to far-reaching reforms. Because different societal forces had been weakened by the genocide, the group that captured power was able to impose its will on the society and conduct a comprehensive project of state and economic reform that has been successful, funded by aid. Are we going to foster a genocide in every country that is so destructive in order to ensure that we have conditions for aid to work? That is impossible. So aid is an ineffective instrument of development policy. The challenge you international development, the kind of people of the world face, is that we can only tell that aid is good and effective and helps a particular country after the fact. It is only when aid has been successful that you can say it was successful. And then you look for the conditions that made it successful. So from the very beginning, the aid giver is always in confusion. What should I do? This is what I want to warn you about. If you want to help a country, you must help it and be blind to the dysfunctions you're going to create. If you want to help a country, don't try to impose your will of democracy, of institutions. You say, I trust this group of people. If Andrew Mwenda, like me, if I am the president, you say, I trust this old man to lead this country well and give money blindly and hope that it will turn out very well. If you cannot, then you get caught up in the problems I see with aid today. Aid is given as budget support. A country begins planning for roads, hospitals, and so many other things based on aid. Tomorrow it passes a law saying we are going to hang homosexuals, like my country, Uganda, did. You cut all the aid because of one thing you disagree with. Then all the plans and projections you had made go to naught. And that's the problem with aid. It's politics. If it was devoid of politics, it would create neutral conditions through which we could judge it. One of the reasons why China is much more successful than the Western world is it does not ask questions. It does not try to impose a particular set of institutions or practices on the recipient countries. And therefore, many African countries are flocking to China for it. Finally, I want to conclude by saying that I always have a caveat on aid. There are many aspects of aid in its micro nature that can be effective. You can begin an aid project may appear in a village because it supports a school or a hospital or a water project and it succeeds. The danger would be for you to take lessons out of this micro project, transplant them onto the whole continent of Africa and South and Asia, and think that they will work in that particular, they will work across the whole world, the whole poor, the whole third world, as they worked in that particular village, ignoring the unique combination of norms, values, habits, attitudes in that particular village, or even skills and history and culture that made that aid project work in a particular village, in a particular poor country, and think that it can be a solution for everybody. I think that the day we stop treating aid as one size fits all and try to treat it as a very specific thing we are going to do in a particular country at a particular time using a particular set of tools, maybe there could be a flicker of a solution. Thank you so much for listening to a very old African chief.